or state control, you decide. This is the book edited by Tom Former. We have the pleasure here today to have him for an interview. Mr. Former's book has been at the very center of our project Reading for Freedom in Argentina. I am Álvaro Arellana, General Coordinator at Fundación para la Responsabilidad Intelectual, and of course I would like to thank Atlas Network for their support and Tom Former for this interview. Welcome you all, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hello, Tom Palmer. Tom Palmer is a great friend. He worked for the Cato Institute. He worked for the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. And right now, he is the voice of all freedom lovers around the world. He's traveling around the world, encouraging people to understand basic principles of freedom and also encouraging them to defend themselves from totalitarian attacks, from criticism, from collectivism. So we are very, very proud to have Tom with us today to discuss his latest book that we found really, really very interesting. Thank you for being with us today, Tom.
Well, thank you, Eduardo. It's so wonderful to be with you. I should also say I followed your career for many years and the work you have done tirelessly to promote a society of free people who live together in prosperity and social harmony. So I really admire the work you do in Argentina and all of Latin America. Thanks for having me.
Thank you again, Tom. And let's start with, I have several questions for you related to the book, but they are universal questions. So please feel free to elaborate according to your experiences. You know, I mentioned a famous writer to you, Jorge Luis Borges. Mr. Borges, one of the best writers and intellectuals of Argentina, and he used to say something that always amazed me, that is, freedom is the space a soul needs. And if he's right, souls need to be developed to avoid the vacuum, to avoid the empty space that will be filled up by dictators and by collectivists through forces, through orders. My question is, which would be the main factors that a society or maybe an individual have to develop to avoid the entry of collectivism in the soul of its citizens or in his individual soul? Do you have any list of things we should be thinking in developing to avoid that?
Well, I really appreciate Borges. I wish I could read him in the Spanish. All my friends tell me it's so much better, but I only read them in other languages. But I appreciate his interest and his commitment to liberty. There are two things I think that come to mind from that important statement, the question you posed. The first is that there's a kind of circular nature of the relationship. We need the space to be free, but it's within that space that we learn how to be free people. And so the approach that some people have taken, particularly, let's call them a certain kind of traditional conservative, that focuses on the state, says it is the state's role to teach us to be good people, so someday we can be free. The problem with that is that when the freedom is denied, we don't learn how to be free. You need freedom in order to acquire the habits of a free person. And so that authoritarian kind of conservatism, and I don't speak of all forms of conservatism, there are others that are more amenable to liberty, but that authoritarian conservatism that says the state will instruct us and teach us in moral virtue. First, it assumes the state will be morally virtuous, and there's not very much empirical support for that. And then second, by doing that, they take away the very conditions of acquiring the good character, which is the freedom, including freedom to make mistakes. This is one of the things that they don't want to allow. The other element that comes to mind is that a conception of freedom that is stable and enduring and that enriches the human personality requires the complementary notion of responsibility. That means that to be a free person, free with others in society, means understanding I have responsibility for my acts. You have responsibility for yours. We are accountable beings. This is something that Aristotle and Adam Smith and many other deep moral thinkers understood and put at the core of their moral philosophy. The idea that to be praised or blamed means we have to have the freedom to make choices, including the freedom to make poor choices, and then to bear the responsibility for those. Indeed, it's the only way that we learn, when there's some feedback mechanism through accountability and responsibility.
My concern here is if you, of course, what you are doing is pointing out the relationship between, if you really want to have responsible people, the only way to develop that sense of responsibility and taking care of your own decisions and responsibility for your own decision and the risks involved is in a freedom environment. And I would like to just to go a little bit deeper and explain why you need a freedom environment to be able to cultivate those good characteristics in human beings, and why, if you try to do it through the government in an authoritarian environment, that's more difficult.
Well, one reason, of course, is when you have an authoritarian state dictating through edicts or punishments behavior, people will then focus on how to evade them. This is very common. So let's take the very clear example of sobriety, that is to say, not being drunk all the time. Advocates of state power in the United States said, we don't want people to be drunk all the time. We all understand how bad that is for human beings. And we've probably all known people who've ruined their lives through alcoholism or narcotics. Therefore, we'll make them illegal. Well, the consequence in the case of alcohol was so demonstrable, and now we're seeing it in narcotics as well. It did not diminish the consumption of those goods. It changed behavior in really bad ways. Take the case of alcohol. It now meant that people who were providing for a demand that was out there in the population had to be outlaws. That is, so they operated outside of the normal law. Their enforcement of agreements was exclusively through violence rather than through recourse to normal courts of law and legal procedures. We call that organized crime. And this is when the mafia in the United States really took off. The murder rate, homicide rate in the United States rose for every consecutive year after alcohol was made illegal, peaking in the point it was legalized again, and then it fell for 11 consecutive years. What did alcohol prohibition drive? It drove homicide, organized crime. It enriched people who specialized in violence. This is exactly what's happened with narco trafficking. And look at the trail of human bodies left behind by this authoritarian measure in Colombia, in El Salvador, in Mexico. The body count is horrifying. And what is it that drives then narco trafficking gangsters like the FARC, or now their replacers? Now they've gone to the peace table in Colombia. Others are moving into this space. Who paid for the Taliban in Afghanistan? The narcotics laws, because almost all of their income came from trafficking heroin. If you want to get rid of the source of revenue for these terrorist gangs, whether it's the Taliban or the Zetas or others who are terrorizing people, legalize narcotics, which means respect the responsibility of people to make decisions for themselves. Many people cannot tolerate the idea that some people will make bad decisions. There will be some people who will ruin their lives through addiction to alcohol or gambling or narcotics or other bad behavior that in excess can cause destruction of life. They're so focused on that they don't notice the vast majority of the population, overwhelming majority, who are able to either abstain voluntarily or to use these things in moderate and reasonable ways, to gamble a little bit for fun, not to ruin their lives, to drink a beer or a glass of wine with their friends, not to become drunk and wake up in the gutter every day. They only see the one in the gutter. They don't see those who behave responsibly, and they conclude everyone is a drunk unless we intervene with the force of coercion. It's an empirical mistake. It's wrong, but it has deep costs, economic, legal, but also psychological on our society. A regime of freedom and responsibility works better.
The paternalistic mentality of, oh, I'm big brother, I have to protect you from your own sins, is incredibly damaging people. And instead of just observing that and reacting accordingly, they just insist. You see, 70% of the prisons in Argentina are full of drug dealers that are being persecuted for the fact of just, and of course, the quantity of money and the type of crimes related, they are increasing all the time. And this was a society without we didn't have that problem. But instead of just allowing the market to work and the people to take responsibility, as you said, they are fighting it, and it's becoming worse and worse. Second question, Tom. Thank you for the first question. First answer, fantastic. The second one is, if all human beings deserve freedom and have the intelligence and potential skills to exercise and implement good decisions and to take responsibility for their own actions, how is that it looks like only Anglo-American countries and some few countries in Europe have developed the abilities to defend individual rights or the idea of being respected? What did you do well to allow that sense of responsibility? Could you, I know that you answered that before, but just let's go back again to see if we can discover another trait that we can develop here in Latin America.
Can I start then by first addressing a topic that was presumption, or I would reformulate it a little bit later, and then address the bigger kind of political question that you raised. And the first point is, I don't believe all human beings are capable of taking responsibility for their behavior. There are people who have very diminished capacity, and for those people, if there's a mental or other disability, there are guardianship relationships to govern them. And this is existing on a scale, and legal systems generally recognize that there are adults who perhaps in Down syndrome and so on don't have the full capacity. But then there's another huge number of people, we call them children. And children grow into responsibility, and that's the responsibility of parents to help them to learn how to become responsible people. And that takes time to do that, and some get there earlier than others. Among adults, though, we assume that there's a threshold condition for the vast majority, setting aside those who have severe handicaps in their ability to foresee the future and think about it, that there's a threshold that we call everyone equal before the law. No one is born with a whip in his or her hand to control all the rest of us. We are equals in society. Now, the second, the deep question that you are focusing on is an interesting one. I don't think that it's exclusively Anglo-Saxon countries. We've seen these principles spread across Europe now, Japan, South Korea as well. These are functioning, free democratic societies. Each one has its imperfections. Each one would fall short of what one would see as the ideal, but that's the nature of human life. But also we see around the world, in every society, people who do act responsibly. It's not only English speakers who act responsibly. In Argentina and Brazil and Mexico and Indonesia, there are millions and millions of people who live their lives peacefully and in a responsible manner. I do think that there's a difference between two legal codes that may play some role, and that is the civil code, which was adopted in a number of countries, formulated by the Napoleonic Code and the long tradition within Roman law, codified the law in a way that is very different from the way it was codified under Anglo-Saxon common law. There's a principle under the common law of a presumption of liberty. Unless it's clearly not allowed, you're permitted to do it. You don't have to justify your behavior to the legal authorities. In contrast, civil code jurisdictions are more likely to establish a presumption of power, that the authorities are presumed to be able to disapprove or punish you for something, and there's no presumption of liberty. I wouldn't put too much stress on this question, because we see that countries can shift along the spectrum of liberty over time, but I think it may have contributed a little bit. Now, does that mean that people who live in countries with legal codes that are somehow connected to the French civil code are doomed? I don't think so at all. There's a change in mentality and a change in government philosophy that is possible everywhere. And I think the key element is this insistence on the presumption of liberty. You do not have to justify to others why you should be allowed to do something. They must justify why you should be restricted. This has huge implications, notably for moral behavior, for the development of character, but also for economic growth. The work of Deirdre McCloskey, the economic historian, her 3-volume work on bourgeois morality, bourgeois dignity, and bourgeois equality, I think established that the presumption of liberty is key to economic growth, to raising the standard of living for everybody. And that really is an important principle that, in my opinion, is really the core of liberalism. It was articulated by Adam Smith. I think we have good reasons to support this in jurisprudence. We have good reasons to support it in moral psychology and character development. And we also have very, very good reasons from the economic consequences to insist on freedom to innovate, freedom to act without permission, or what is called now permissionless innovation.
I agree completely. I think that when you are in a country under that legislation, everything is allowed unless somebody complains, right, that one of his rights is being hurt. So just that's when the authority enters into a scene. But in our countries, you need to ask, everything is forbidden. So you need to ask permission for everything. So you need the good appreciation of the judge or the inspector to allow you to work. And that changed the mentality, that's true. But before just going to some other historical facts, I would like, for example, I started Junior Achievement as a way to teach kids to take decisions, because I thought that if they learn to take decisions, they risk the fact of taking decisions, and maybe to be wrong, they would learn that sense of responsibility. Is there any link, do you think, between the fact of taking decisions and being able to fail without being hurt or being accused? And because the feeling I had in your society, in the American society, is that if you make a mistake, they take you like, okay, that was another way to try, but keep trying, just go for it, impossible is nothing, and just do it, and think big, those big junior achievement issues, and the kids love it, and they feel encouraged to take decisions. So it's also related to some psychological aspects of encouraging people to say, okay, don't be afraid, be courageous, and if you fail, what's wrong with it? Just it's your life. And right, I think that maybe do you have any example, anything come to your mind related to that?
Well, there is actually quite substantial literature in sociology and economics and psychology about the excessive fear of failure, specifically the fear of being ashamed because you're a failure, you tried it and you failed. And there does seem to be a strong relationship between willingness to say, okay, I tried that, it didn't work, and I'll try something else, without this feeling of shame, that is quite strongly connected to prosperity, because people will try a business and it doesn't work. Some really great business people, they failed and failed and failed, and then they came up with the idea, project that was so successful. So excessive fear of social shame because you tried and failed, I think is harmful to people. It doesn't mean that there's no role for shame if you act in a way that's harmful to other people or something you know to be wrong, or you hurt another person. Feelings of shame are appropriate and help us to correct our behavior. But being ashamed because you tried something ambitious and it didn't work is a mistake. And that's a kind of psychological shift that I think is important. And countries, by the way, have shown that they can change in that regard. They can become more entrepreneurial. It's sometimes claimed in the economics of institutions literature that institutions can change quickly, but customs and mores change very slowly. It turns out that's not true. Sometimes we can see customs change quite rapidly. And look at the transformation in one lifetime in South Korea from an authoritarian dictatorship with a long history of autocratic government under Japanese colonialism, but before it under the Korean emperors. And South Korea has become a free, open, vivid society. North Korea stayed with the old system. It is in many ways a continuation of Korean, the bad side of Korean history. South Korea has flourished. It's still Korean, but it adopted this change. Or take another example of something that changed very rapidly, and that is the acceptance of same-gender marriage. People said, oh my God, thousands of years, et cetera, it'll never change. In a period really of less than a decade, public opinion and attitudes just flip-flopped on that, from 70% condemning it to 70% saying yes, why not? It was really an astonishing change in mores and the social acceptance for people who wanted to live together and have a loving relationship of mutual obligation.
But you know, pioneers pay the price, right? To be the first ones in just challenging the status quo and the conservative ideas. I know that you have been in Ukraine defending freedom. You are not just a talker. You just go and participate in the fight, not with a gun, but you are there just encouraging Ukrainians to defend themselves and giving them not only weapons, but also intellectual arguments to be able to fight the intellectual battle. If you compare Ukraine with Russia, I read several articles saying that in Russia, they have that tribal mentality coming from the Mongols, maybe. But if you see that in Ukraine, it's different. What's going on in Putin's mind related to this issue of self-responsibility and the Russians, and how do they compare with the Ukrainians? What did they change in Ukraine to be able to just to go for freedom?
You know, it's such a complex set of issues: psychological, historical, political, and so on.
Do your best.
Okay. Well, the Russian state did not develop systems of reciprocity that we saw in other parts of the world, certainly in Europe. And the reason was because of the Mongol conquest, which you mentioned, they didn't develop any intermediary institutions between the person and the Tsar. Tsar comes from Caesar, the claim to be the emperor. The princes of Muscovy seized power because they were the tax collectors for the Golden Horde, the remnant of the Mongol conquest. And that meant if you didn't pay your taxes, the Golden Horde would annihilate your village, kill everyone. In distinction from what happened in the rest of Europe, where there was a negotiation between taxpayers and tax collectors. Hardly perfect, certainly predatory, but over time, some understanding of reciprocity. You do this, I'll do that. And if you don't do that, I won't do that. This did not happen in Russia, where people were considered 100% of the population were slaves of the Tsar. It means they didn't have any intermediary nobility. There was, of course, one city that was more like the rest of Europe called Novgorod, which was an independent free city. They elected a prince. I mean, it really was quite advanced. They had a Charter of Liberties before Magna Carta in England. Magna Carta is not uniquely
Where
English.
is that city located, Tom?
It's in Russia today, but it was attacked by the two Tsars, Ivan,
El Terrible, Ivan the Terrible.
and they exterminated it, totally wiped it off the map. So there's still a place there, but they extinguished the independent polity of Novgorod, which was a free independent city, a member of the Hansa, the Hanseatic League, and so on. So they subjected everyone to a rigid hierarchical system with a Tsar at the top. Now there were liberals, libertarians, if you will, in Russia who were challenging this. One of the saddest moments ever was when Tsar Alexander was on his way to sign a new constitution, having liberated the serfs, and he was assassinated by a nihilist. And Russia then turned back towards this hyper-authoritarian system. And then, of course, the Soviets, they took power and they built on that tradition to build an even more terrifying dictatorship. When that dictatorship collapsed and the various republics were given their independence, I think for all of his problems, Boris Yeltsin did a noble thing when he said, let them go. And Ukraine became an independent state, the Baltics also, and others. It began to take a divergence. In contrast, when Putin came to power, he began to consolidate power to become a new Tsar. And he basically is the new Tsar of Russia, absolute power. It has consequences, by the way. People lied to him. His own advisors lied to him because they're afraid of him. Dictatorship isn't always so effective because no free conversation, you can't get reliable information. They're all afraid of the dictator. They've been arresting people and charging them with treason all across Russia now because they failed. They absconded with money that had been put into the army. The army was in a catastrophically bad state. Their only great advantages are, one, they are brutal beyond belief. They behead people. They castrate captured soldiers and put it on videos. They post heads on pikes. They fill basements with executed bodies of civilians with their hands bound. They rape and assault girls and women and boys. Anyone is subject to their power, and they're looting the country. It's unbelievable. That's one thing. Second is they inherited most of the Soviet arsenal, which means a huge amount of artillery that they're using to flatten Ukrainian cities and to utterly destroy the infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and so on. Ukraine began to change, though. People became less afraid of the authorities, even though they were often very badly behaved. People were not just afraid of them. It really was a transformative moment. And now, with the invasion that started in 2014, this war did not start February 24 of this year. It started in 2014 with armed invasion. Crimea and Donbass. And don't let anyone fool you saying, well, these were uprisings of local people. It's a complete lie. From the very beginning, it was the Russian army, the Russian artillery, the Russian tanks. Local groups don't go buy tanks at hardware stores, at least not any place I've lived. This was the Russian army. The first prime minister of the Donetsk People's Republic was a Russian FSB man, a security service man, Alexander Borodai. The first so-called defense minister of this phony puppet state, Yegor Girkin, also from Moscow, also a security agent of the Kremlin, an FSB man. This was entirely an invasion. And then they ramped up a war of genocide and conquest, February 24 of this year. And Ukrainians have been responding to this with a lot of soul searching and asking, what do we want to be? Do we want to be just another tribe fighting that tribe? Or do we want our identity to be one of pluralism? That's the key. In Ukraine, Many people speak Russian every day in family and everyday life. Kiev is a largely Russian-speaking city. You can speak Russian or Ukrainian or Tatar or Hungarian or Romanian. These are all spoken there. Polish as well. You can go to Russian Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Greek Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, Baptist Church, synagogue, a mosque, and be a Ukrainian. You don't have to say only the language and religion defines you as Ukrainian. It means the emergence and further articulation of a civic identity, the identity of a free citizen as a citizen of a country. This is a further differentiation of Russia, which has become much more a dictatorship based on the rule, frankly, white supremacy, the rule of the white Russian rulers over a subjugated population, versus Ukraine, pluralistic, imperfect, but pluralistic and based on a presumption of freedom to choose your own identity.
If you I was thinking in the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution and that intermediate corps of governors between the king and the population, just asking for rights and just stopping the king of just loitering or just enslaving the population. And that's probably, but that was a long process, right? Because England had also a lot of bloody kings that were just killing the population and exterminating, but they kept fighting, and little by little they developed that sense of pride that was translated to your American farmers, that later with John Locke and Adam Smith, and they just go for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, right? Is that right?
Well, yes and no, in the following sense that the trajectory you articulate, I think, is quite right. But remember that many of those thinkers drew on figures from the Spanish scholastics. There's a very clear influence on British friends of liberty of ideas articulated by Spanish thinkers. This is clear and has been, I think, demonstrated. So it's not just a Protestant or Catholic thing. There are lots of Catholic thinkers who articulated the ideas of liberty so importantly. Sometimes they didn't quote them because there was a military, political, religious conflict, but the influence is unmistakable. And there also was a tradition on the Iberian Peninsula of the independent communities and their negotiation with the royalty. One, I think, catastrophe that befell the Iberian Peninsula was the bankrupting impact of their empire. That is to say, all of the silver that flowed back, this crazy mercantilistic idea of believing that money is wealth, and therefore with more gold and silver. Well, of course, this bankrupted Spain and Portugal. The idea that the Marxists in Lenin's tradition have said, oh, it's imperialism that made countries rich is nonsense. Spanish imperialism bankrupted Spain. It was a disaster. It left them poor and weak as a consequence. But it also led to this centralization of authority in the hands of the monarch, who got all the inflow of the specie, the gold and silver, and had a very negative impact. Now, Britain, of course, also had a mercantilistic policy, was quite harmful to the British as well. As Adam Smith pointed out, just the interest on the debt that they acquired in their acquisition of empire was greater than all the profits that British merchants acquired by having exclusive access to the colonies. So Adam Smith and others demonstrated empire was very bad for the imperialist nation. It was a net drain. But those people who went to the British colonies often pushed back, and the American colonists were the first to do that, and said, we will not live like this, because they demanded this older tradition of Magna Carta. Would that had happened with the Spanish colonies. One difference, of course, though, was that the Spanish Empire sent administrators from Spain. They didn't trust any of the local-born people. The difference in the British colonies was they had local assemblies, they elected leaders who actually had authority in the local community. And I think that was another place where those two systems began to diverge. But I reject the essentialist argument that there's something essential about Hispanic or Iberian culture that led to this kind of failure, or something essential about the Anglo-Saxons. There are lots of accidents along the way, choices that were made that had consequences.
No, I don't mean race, but in general ideas. If you see Spain as a reduct or a refugee for the people that was against the reform in religion, and just the centralization of power through the Jesuits, and the idea of just delegating power to the Jesuits to educate people in a very centralized way, where you have authorities deciding for everybody, and the Indians and the rest of the population being treated as kids. And also the monopoly in trade was stronger, was tight in Spain and between the colonies. If you wanted to trade from Buenos Aires to Spain through the port of Cádiz or Sevilla, what you had to do is to wait until the goods go from Spain to Panama, from Panama to Lima, and from Lima in a donkey, they went to Buenos Aires. They were expensive, almost, so the people was almost nude. There was nothing in Buenos Aires. So the Brazilians and the Portuguese were trading through the River Plate, just exchanging goods through that. But I agree with you that yes, and also the scholastic did a great job, but most of the scholastic monks were persecuted. Some of them were killed too. So instead, what you see, they were more respected. What you have John Locke, David Hume, and later John Stuart Mill, or just Bentham or Spencer, what you see is a constant people just defending freedom. And that takes me to the next question, because you have German.
One thing though, John Locke had to flee England in fear for his life.
I didn't know that.
Yes, he was going to be killed. Algernon Sidney was executed. So many of them were punished or executed. It's not that somehow they were able to talk in freedom and they weren't in Spain. People with power generally like to keep it, and they don't like criticism. It's true that something different happened. These people survived, but I don't think it was somehow inevitable. It could have gone differently.
I agree. And you have in France also Voltaire or Montesquieu. They're also being persecuted. And you have here two sides, because you have the Jacobins, right? Because with Rousseau and Robespierre and Danton and Saint-Just, all the people just being just the big government and the big assemblea taking decisions for everybody, against people just Alexis de Tocqueville, just people who were just fighting for just let's divide power, but you see in France.
And people you know well, like Frédéric Bastiat, who built on a tradition, Benjamin Constant, Jean-Baptiste Say, Charles Desnoyers, Charles Comte, this beautiful tradition of liberalism, which I should point out was deeply influential on the American founders.
Yes, Jefferson, John Adams, yeah.
I resist putting things in silos as the Anglo-Saxons.
Okay, so explain to me Germany, because Germany was a very cultivated society, smart people, probably the most educated people in Europe. And instead of just developing just resistance towards government and the Kaiser and Adolf, they were just following a dictatorship. Why is that? How do you explain Germany? The philosophers?
Again, it's very complicated and hard to describe, and it's a topic I'm deeply interested in. I'm reading currently a lot of literature on German liberalism and why it failed, why it collapsed. It was defeated. It was defeated by Bismarckian conservative socialism, state socialism, as he put it, and by the forces of nationalism. And it is a complex story. But there were many, many very influential and significant German freedom advocates. Think Wilhelm von Humboldt is an obvious one. Immanuel Kant, some people are highly critical of him, but he did put individual freedom and equality before the law at the center of his philosophical contribution. Eugen Richter in the German parliament, John Prince Smith, many, many others. But they did fail, and they were defeated. And the ideals, what they call the ideals of 1914, which were statism, socialism, collectivism, and war, became dominant. And then, of course, the horror of what was called the conservative revolution. This was an explicitly anti-liberty movement. I'm currently reading Thomas Mann's Reflections of an Unpolitical Man, which was an early statement of this, came out shortly after the war ended. It was an intellectual rejection of freedom and responsibility. And by the way, both of those in favor of a collective identity that they claimed was a unique spiritual experience, different from all the rest of the world, and immersed in explicitly collectivist ideas. So we need to understand these things, but we also need to learn from the mistakes. What was it that the liberals did? How did they not successfully respond to these? And then finally, there's sometimes just accidents in history that are difficult to explain. It just could have gone the other way. Some person made the wrong decision in certain situation. Most people in 1932 did not anticipate what was going to happen when the National Socialists came to power. That includes some of their supporters and almost all of their opponents. They thought these people are absurd, they're clowns. They'll have a few days, a few months, a year, and they'll be booted out because they're idiots. But those people moved with lightning speed to seize control of all institutions in the state and then the society. And the result, of course, was a nightmare that's very difficult for us to conceive. Yes.
Last two questions, Tom. Very descriptive, very interesting, your answers. Related to Europe now and the situation that looks around the world, not just Europe, these conflicts between China and Taiwan and the involvement of the United States and what's going on with Russia. In which part of history are we now, and how do you see which are the outcomes that could come, and what's your view of the future? Are you optimistic, or just are we going to be involved in a terrible war? Or what's going to happen? Be a guru for us. Tell us.
We're in the unknown part. If I knew how to predict the future precisely, I'd be much richer than I am. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I do think it's important for us to stand up for our ideas of free societies, stand up for liberal democracy, with all of its faults and failings. And we acknowledge those, but it's better than the other alternatives. But liberal democracy requires insisting on limited government, and this is a key point. A democracy that doesn't have limited government will cease to be a democracy, because once the majority or whoever gets power has unlimited powers, they will make sure they don't lose office. They will control the society. So we don't even know what the majority opinion is anymore. It ceases to be a democracy. Illiberal democracy is a contradiction. Democracy requires liberty for its sustenance, and we have to insist on that. But then the last point, and it ties in with this theme of the book, by the way, of self-control or state control. And I'm so grateful for your work and having translated this. I know it was hard.
We love the book. Fantastic. Great job.
Well, it was hard to do in the English, and I suspect that translating into Spanish would be just really a chore, a challenge. But what I want to focus on is that opposing authoritarianism and dictatorship can take many different forms. One is, yes, standing up, being the brave person with a shield of liberty against the state.
Yeah.
But it also means those smaller decisions we make in our lives to treat other people with respect, to acquire the habits of respecting one another, and with children, to acquire the habit of helping them grow into societies in which they will be free and responsible people. All of those things that we do every day in our lives as citizens, as members of the society, as parents and uncles and aunts and so on, they're all capable of contributing to a free society. So it's not just the big battles against
the daily attitudes.
It's the daily things that we do when we show respect to other people and insist on respect for ourselves, when we teach children to think about the consequences of their behavior, to acquire good habits of self-governance. All of those are contributions to the struggle to live in freedom and dignity.
Well, my last question was going to be related to what you just said. We are training all the libertarian parties in Argentina, the youth, the future legislators and judges, and we got the responsibility of training them. We started with the free market economic course, and we are developing a philosophy for freedom course, and maybe history course, and we have around 250 kids now, kids and professionals, young professionals that are being trained by us. But I would love just a final message to them. They are learning free market economics, and on what can they, just if you could say it in a different way, to what kind of attitudes can they develop in their lives, not only to face government and to stop big power, but also in their daily decisions. For us to make a short with this last sentence, talk to them, Tom.
Well, in the book, there are a lot of very concrete recommendations. The last chapter is focused on that. Things like psychological means we can use to live better lives. Here's a simple example. People who say, I will deny everything that I want. I want to eat those potato chips or those fries. I refuse. No, promise yourself you'll have them later. And it turns out you'll have fewer later. You can control your weight better in that way. Instead of saying, no, zero, that almost always fails. Tell yourself, I'll get a reward later. Think about the rewards. I'll take a simple personal example. Sometimes if I say, oh, I'd really like to have a glass of wine before I go to bed, I say, no, I'll reward myself by being clear-headed in the morning and focus on that reward. It's like I give up the pleasure I would have of having a nice glass of Argentine Malbec. I would enjoy that. But I say in the morning, I will wake up clear-headed with no headache and no fuzziness. That's a reward. So we can reward ourselves in this way. There are lots of ways, and the book has a whole chapter on these matters. The last point, though, that I think is very central to what you're doing, which I greatly admire, is for people to take an attitude of respect for their fellow citizens and not to be consumed by anger and rage. Philosophies that focus on hatred and enemy mentality and hating the other people, and I have to say, we see this in the freedom movement too. They ultimately psychologically destroy the freedom movement because a movement based on rage, and anger, and hatred will always turn into collectivism. We've seen it historically. I've seen it in my own life. Angry people end up becoming collectivists. They want to hate. We should start out by saying, I don't want to be an angry person. I don't want to be full of rage and hatred in my life. And I want to find ways that I can live in peace with other people who disagree with me, who have different ways of living. It's okay. I want to live the best life that I can live. And part of that is to secure freedom for myself and others. But I don't want to go through life hating my enemies or hating my neighbors and considering them my enemies. This tribalism is destroying freedom in the United States. To take an example, Republicans and Democrats, they don't talk to each other. They don't communicate with each other. Turns out there's been a change, a measurable change in opinion. Republican parents say they would be ashamed and find it unacceptable if their children married a Democrat, and Democratic parents say the same thing. That means they don't want to live together in society. And that means a society that won't enjoy personal freedom. It's collapsing into collectivism because of this hatred of the other. And for young Argentines who want their society, their country, to be one of prosperity and dignity, for Argentina to become the rich country it should be, it means rejecting the mentality of hatred and collectivism.